Good evening, dear listener. I'm ever so pleased you've joined us tonight. You've arrived at Driftwood Stories, a quiet little harbour where tales are told slowly, gently, and always in good time for rest. Perhaps you've had a long day, or maybe you're simply seeking a soft place to land. Either way, you're most welcome here. Settle in now. Find yourself a cosy corner, a warm blanket, or just a still moment in the hush of evening. Let the world drift a little further away. You've nothing to do now but listen. Tonight's story is a favourite of mine. It's about a pirate, though not the sort that chases gold or storms about with swords and shouting. No, this pirate is a gentler soul. Captain Mossbeard is his name. He sails not in search of treasure, but of places that have forgotten how to grow. This is a tale of quiet adventure, of trees planted where none dared grow, and of how the smallest kindnesses can awaken the world. The pirate who planted trees. Out on the open sea, where the sky stretches wide and blue and the waves move with a lullaby's rhythm, sailed a ship unlike any other. It was called the Green Whisper, and though it had sails and ropes like any good pirate vessel, it was known for something different. For you see, this ship had leaves. They curled around the wooden rails and stretched up the masts like ivy. Tiny blossoms peeked from the rigging, ferns grew near the wheel, and potted trees swayed gently as the ship rocked. Even the figurehead at the front, once a fierce mermaid, had been replaced with a carving of a peaceful oak, and its captain, a man of mystery and moss. They called him Captain Mossbeard. His beard was thick and green, with real moss growing in it, fed by sunlight and sea spray. His coat was stitched with vines, and his boots were softened with bark. Some said he could speak to plants. Others said he once traded a chest of gold for a single seed. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Mossbeard was no ordinary pirate. He didn't plunder gold or jewels. He didn't storm towns or demand tribute. No. Captain Mossbeard planted trees. Each island he visited, each cove he anchored in, he left behind a sapling, a sprout, or a handful of seeds, tucked into the earth like quiet promises. Gold is spent, he'd say with a twinkle in his eye, but a tree keeps giving. The crew of the Green Whisper was an odd bunch too. There was Tilly the cook, who baked biscuits shaped like leaves and steeped seaweed tea every evening. There was old Jeb, who once sailed with real pirates, but now carved tiny owls into driftwood and sang lullabies to the wind. And Nico, the youngest of the crew, wide-eyed and curious, always asking why the captain cared more about roots than riches. Mossbeard would smile and ruffle Nico's hair. "You'll see, lad," he'd say, "you'll see." The ship sailed softly, never in a rush. They followed the tides. They listened to the stars. Some days they'd anchor beside an uncharted island just to watch a rare flower bloom. Other days they'd drift for hours while Mossbeard read aloud from his giant book of trees. The sea around them was peaceful. Dolphins leapt in lazy arcs. Gulls called gently overhead. The wood of the ship creaked like a rocking chair, and the scent of pine and salt filled the air. It was a good life, quiet, curious, and green, but it was about to change. not with cannon fire or battle cries, but with something smaller, a bottle, floating on the waves. It was Nico who spotted it first. He was leaning over the side of the Green Whisper, watching jellyfish pulse beneath the surface, when something bobbing on the waves caught his eye. "Captain," he called, "there's a bottle." Mossbeard was watering his marigolds when he looked up. Glass or driftwood? Glass, with paper inside. That got everyone's attention. Soon the bottle was scooped up in a net and laid gently on the deck. It was old, sea-worn, sealed tight with wax and barnacles. The crew gathered around as Mossbeard carefully cracked it open. Inside was a brittle, yellowing piece of parchment, hand-drawn with spidery ink and faded lines. "A map," whispered Tilly. Jeb squinted. "But not just any map. Look at that symbol." In the top corner, drawn in faded silver ink, was a tree, leafless, its roots spiralling like a maze. Below it, scrawled in curling script, were 3 words: Isle of Echoes, and beneath that, where no tree dares grow, treasure sleeps below. The crew looked at one another. An island with no trees? In all their travels they'd never heard of such a place. Mossbeard gently ran a mossy finger along the edge of the map. "No trees?" he murmured. "Not even one?" That night the ship swayed quietly beneath the stars, and no one sang lullabies or told stories. They just stared at the map, lit by a single lantern, as the waves lapped gently below. Mossbeard traced the path on the chart, winding between islands, through a hidden current, past a shoal shaped like a serpent's spine. "Should we follow it, Captain?" Nico asked, voice hushed. Mossbeard didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the sea, where the moonlight shimmered like silver leaves. "Sometimes," he said softly, "when the wind brings you something strange, you follow it." He rolled up the map and tucked it into his coat. At first light, he said, "We sail for the Isle of Echoes." The Green Whisper set sail at dawn. The ocean was still sleepy, its surface a satin sheet of blues and purples brushed by the rising sun. The sails caught a soft wind that seemed to know exactly where to go, and the ship glided forward like it was being led by an invisible hand. Mossbeard stood at the helm, his eyes on the horizon. The rest of the crew worked in quiet rhythm, not hurried, not tense, just thoughtful. Something about the map had settled in their bones like a forgotten song. Even the ship creaked softer, as if it too was holding its breath. Days passed in a dreamy hush. At night the stars shimmered like spilled sugar across the sky. Nico, curled up in a hammock under the open air, stared upward and wondered what the Isle of Echoes might look like. Would it be silent, lonely, or maybe waiting? Mossbeard read aloud in the evenings from his great green book, stories of ancient trees, of forests that sang, of groves that whispered secrets to those who listened long enough. His voice was low and slow, like wind moving through tall grass. One night, as the ship drifted past an island shaped like a sleeping whale, Tilly leaned on the rail and said softly, "Feels like we're not just travelling over the sea. Feels like we're drifting between the pages of a story." Mossbeard smiled. "Maybe we are." On the 4th day, the weather changed. Not stormy, but strange. The wind went quiet. Yet the ship kept moving. The sky turned a paler blue, the kind that looked faded from memory. The air smelled like rain that had fallen 1,000 years ago. And then they began to notice the sounds were changing. No gulls, no waves crashing, just the creak of the ship and the gentle rustle of leaves on the deck. Even the sea seemed to grow still, too still. That evening, Jeb whispered to Nico, "They say the Isle of Echoes is where sound goes to sleep." Nico's eyes widened. "Is that true?" Jeb shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe it's where quiet things go to be heard." The next morning, just as the mist began to roll across the sea like drifting silk, someone spotted it. "Land!" called Tilly from the crow's nest. "Off the port bow!" The crew gathered silently as the island came into view. It was small, ringed in pale cliffs, with a single cove carved into its edge like a smile. Mist clung to the trees that should have been there, but weren't. The island wasn't bare, not quite, but it felt empty, as if something had been missing for a long, long time. As the green whisper slipped into the quiet cove, even the water seemed to hush in reverence. There were no birds, no breeze, just the sound of their own breath and the wood beneath their feet. Mossbeard stepped ashore first, his boots crunching softly on a layer of dry leaves, but no trees, just leaves and silence. He knelt, pressed a hand to the soil, and closed his eyes. "Well?" Tilly whispered. Mossbeard opened his eyes slowly. "The island remembers," he said, "but it's forgotten how to grow." He stood, brushing his hands off. "Let's find the clearing." The crew moved through the island with slow, careful steps. There were paths, though no one had made them. Trails where grass refused to grow. Spaces between ancient rocks where wind once whispered. It was as if the forest had once existed long, long ago and had simply left. The deeper they walked, the quieter it became. Even their footsteps sounded far away, like echoes from another time. Mossbeard walked at the front, his hand resting lightly on a satchel at his side, the one where he kept his seed pouch. He glanced at the trees around them, or rather where trees should have been. The roots were there, twisted and dry, but nothing stood tall. Only the faint scent of memory lingered. "Strange place," muttered Jeb, like a song with all the notes taken out. Nico didn't speak. He just looked up, then down, then up again, as if he expected to see shadows where branches should be. "Captain," he finally asked, "do you think something happened here?" Mossbeard nodded slowly. "I do. I think something was taken or forgotten." They reached the clearing just before dusk. It wasn't large, about the size of a small village square. Round, quiet, pale earth stretched from one side to the other, soft and dry like old parchment. In the centre stood a stone pedestal. On it sat a wooden chest, aged and cracked, wrapped in vines that were brittle with time. The crew stopped at the edge of the clearing, as if crossing into it might wake something sleeping. "Well," whispered Tilly, "there's the treasure, I suppose." Mossbeard stepped forward alone. The air shifted as he moved, like a breath drawn in by the island itself. He walked to the chest and placed one hand gently on the lid. It opened without a sound. Inside was no gold, no gems, no scrolls or keys, just soil. Dark, dry, crumbly soil. Mossbeard reached in and let it run through his fingers. It fell in slow motion, as if reluctant to leave his palm. He smiled. "Well," Jeb called, "is it cursed? Is it magic?" Mossbeard shook his head. "It's waiting." He turned to the crew, eyes soft, voice steady. "This island isn't empty," he said. "It's sleeping, grieving, maybe, forgotten, but not lost." He knelt beside the pedestal and opened his seed pouch. "One seed," he whispered. "That's all a forest needs." From his pouch he drew out a small, wrinkled seed, shaped like a tear, coloured like dust. He held it to the light, kissed his fingers and pressed it gently into the earth at the base of the stone. No lightning struck, no wind howled, but something happened. The silence changed. It didn't break, it softened, as if something deep beneath the island had let go of a long-held breath. A breeze stirred the edge of the clearing. Leaves rustled on branches that weren't there, and then a sound, a bird. Just one, a single note, high and delicate, like a memory remembered. Nico looked at the captain. "Did you hear that?" Mossbeard nodded, still kneeling. The island did. The crew, one by one, followed Mossbeard's lead. Tilly planted a sprig of lavender she always kept behind her ear. Jeb tucked in a walnut. Nico buried a tiny seashell, not a seed, but something precious nonetheless. And as the last offering was placed in the soil, the mist above the clearing lifted, just a little. A crack of golden light spilled through, painting the dry earth with the colour of morning. They stood in stillness for a long moment, and then turned back to the ship. There was nothing left to take, but everything left to grow. Chapter 5, Seeds of Change. That night, the crew camped just beyond the clearing, beneath a pale sky stretched thin with stars. There was no fire, only lanterns with soft yellow light and blankets wrapped around shoulders. The air was cool and strangely kind, like the island was watching them sleep. Nico stayed awake longer than the others, staring into the branches of a tree that wasn't there. "Do you think it will grow?" he asked Mossbeard quietly. The captain, who was leaning back on a mossy log with his hat over his face, lifted it just enough to speak. "If the island remembers how," he said, "then yes. Sometimes all it takes is a little company." When morning came, something had changed. It was subtle, the kind of change you almost don't notice unless you're looking for it. The wind smelled softer. The air held a warmth not there before, and in the middle of the clearing, near the spot where Mossbeard had planted his seed, a single green sprout had pushed its way through the earth. It wasn't tall, it wasn't grand, but it was alive, and that made it, to the crew of the Green Whisper, the most beautiful thing in the world. They didn't rush back to the ship. Instead, they stayed. Tilly began singing again, not loudly, but in a whisper hum that wound between the trees that weren't and filled the spaces between things. Jeb found a stone that looked like a turtle and carved little vines into its shell. Even the ship, docked in the quiet cove, seemed to relax. The ropes swaying lazily, sails fluttering like sleepy sighs. Mossbeard wandered the edge of the clearing for hours, speaking in soft tones to roots and stones. Sometimes he'd kneel and place his palm against the ground. Other times he simply closed his eyes and listened. And Nico, curious, bright-eyed Nico, sat cross-legged beside the sprout, watching it like it might tell him a secret if he waited long enough. On the second night, it rained. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a gentle, steady fall, like the island itself was being bathed for the first time in a long while. And in the morning there were 2 sprouts. The second one had grown near the seashell Nico had buried. The boy gasped and ran to Mossbeard. "It grew! Mine grew!" Mossbeard knelt beside him, eyes shining. "Aye," he said, "even seashells hold stories. And sometimes stories help things grow." By the 3rd day, birds had returned to the trees that had not yet grown. They chirped from invisible branches, as if remembering what once was. Tiny green shoots pushed up between rocks. A vine curled gently around the edge of the pedestal. The mist that had clung to the island for who knows how long began to rise and drift away, like fog lifting from a memory. And something else changed too. The crew. They laughed more, soft, belly-deep chuckles that hadn't been heard in weeks. Tilly began planting herbs in her apron pockets, just in case. Jeb carved new leaves into the figurehead of the ship. And Mossbeard, standing at the edge of the clearing one last time, laid his hand on the tallest sprout and whispered, "You'll do well." When they boarded the Green Whisper to leave, the island was still quiet. But not the same kind of quiet. Not empty, not echoing. Now it was the quiet of things beginning, of roots stretching, of the first breath before a forest speaks. As the ship pulled away from the cove, Nico looked back. The clearing was already fading into the mist, but just before it disappeared, a single leaf, bright and green, fell from somewhere above, drifted down like a feather, and landed softly on the deck. Mossbeard picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and tucked it gently into the pages of his book. He looked to the horizon, where soft clouds gathered. "Let's go home," he said. "We've got seeds to share." The Green Whisper sailed soft and slow on the journey home, as if the ship itself didn't want to rush the return. The sails caught a lazy breeze, and the hull hummed with something new, not music exactly, but the quiet rhythm of purpose. Mossbeard stood at the helm, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his book, now heavier, filled not just with notes and drawings, but with something more. A leaf, still green, pressed gently between its pages. Nico stood beside him, eyes on the horizon. "Captain," he asked, "where is home exactly?" Mossbeard smiled. "Wherever the next seed needs planting, lad." And so that's what they did. They never returned to one port or settled in one cove. Instead, the Green Whisper became a floating forest, a ship that drifted not in search of treasure, but in search of places that had forgotten how to grow, islands that had lost their trees, villages with no gardens, shorelines with only sand and silence. At each place, the crew would step ashore with soft hands and quiet smiles, tuck seeds into the earth, and leave behind the gentlest kind of treasure, the kind that takes root and waits patiently to bloom. Word spread, though no one ever saw it happen. Sailors spoke of a ship with green sails and flower pots on its deck. Children whispered of a pirate with moss in his beard who traded stories for soil. Even far-off cities where stone had replaced soil and shadows stretched tall began to hear rumours of tiny forests springing up overnight. In alleys, on rooftops, between cracks in cobblestone. No one ever saw who planted them, but if you listened closely, you might hear the wind carry a single word, soft and sure. Mossbeard. Nico grew, as all children do, but he never left the ship. He learned the language of roots and rain, the songs of seedlings, the patience of planting. His pockets were always filled with seeds, and when asked what he wanted to be when he was older, he simply said, "Kind." Jeb grew slower but wiser. He carved new creatures into the rails of the ship: owls, foxes, squirrels, deer, all the ones they imagined might live in the forests they left behind. Tilly's biscuits began to taste like lavender and lemon balm, and the scent of her tea carried the calm of meadow winds. And Mossbeard, some say he began to walk more slowly, not because he was tired, but because he was listening more deeply to the trees he'd planted, to the whispers of wind, to the stories still waiting in the soil. One morning, in a quiet cove shaded by cliffs, Nico found a strange tree growing on the deck, one no one had planted. Its bark was the colour of driftwood, its leaves soft as feathers. "What kind is it?" Nico asked. Mossbeard smiled, setting his book down gently. "One that grows only on ships that remember." He sat beside the tree, leaned back and closed his eyes. The crew didn't say much that day. They just let the breeze carry them forward, the new tree swaying gently above them, and the sea sparkling like stories yet to be told. And so the green whisper sailed on, not chasing riches, not chasing fame, just planting kindness, one tree at a time. Moral of the story: the most lasting treasures aren't buried in chests or guarded by maps. They are planted, patiently, quietly, and shared without asking anything in return.